You remember 1962, don't you? Kennedy was in the White House, and if you were lucky enough to have a few $1,000s burning a hole in your pocket, the sports car world was your oyster. Maybe you walked into a British Leyland showroom that year, or perhaps you saw one parked outside the local pub, that little wedge-shaped beauty with the Spitfire badge gleaming on its bonnet. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, another video about Triumphs versus MGs. But hear me out, because this isn't about which car was better. If you owned an MG Midget back then, you loved it, and rightly so. But here's the thing, those of us who ended up with Spitfires discovered some engineering tricks that made our MG driving mates just a little bit envious. They might not have admitted it at the pub, mind you, but you could see it in their eyes when we tilted that entire front end forward to check the oil while they were still wrestling with their bonnets. The Spitfire wasn't born in some ivory tower. Harry Webster and his team at Standard Triumph were working against the clock and a tight budget. BMC had the Midget selling like hotcakes, and Triumph needed an answer fast. What Giovanni Michelotti penned and what rolled out of Coventry was something special, even if it took a few years for people to fully appreciate why. Over 18 years, from 62 through 80, they built roughly 314,000 of these little fighters. You probably knew someone who had one. Maybe it was your neighbor's son, fresh out of university. Maybe it was that eccentric school teacher who'd drive it year-round, top down in February if the sun dared show its face. Perhaps it was you, making those weekend runs through the countryside, discovering just how much fun you could have without breaking the speed limit or the bank. The Spitfire name itself meant something to our generation. We'd grown up with stories of the Battle of Britain, those elliptical wings cutting through the sky. This car wasn't trying to be that fast, Lord knows it wasn't, but it carried that same British spirit, clever, determined, making the most of what you had. What made the Spitfire special wasn't always obvious when you first sat in one. You had to live with it, work on it, drive it on a damp Tuesday morning to work and then blast through the lanes on Sunday afternoon. That's when you discovered the details, the thoughtful bits of engineering that solved problems you didn't even know you had until you drove something else. Secret 1. The swing spring independent rear suspension. Let's start with perhaps the most controversial yet ingenious aspect of the Spitfire, its swing spring independent rear suspension. While the MG Midget soldered on with a traditional leaf spring live axle setup borrowed from pre-war thinking, Triumph engineers took a different path. The swing spring system used a single, transverse leaf spring mounted to the differential, with swing axles allowing each rear wheel to move independently. Now, experienced drivers know this setup had its quirks lift off mid-corner in early models, and you might experience some dramatic positive camber changes. But here's what MG owners envied. On smooth roads and in normal driving, the Spitfire rode like a car from a higher class entirely. The comfort advantage was undeniable. Where the Midget bucked and hopped over rough surfaces, the Spitfire soaked up irregularities with composure. Triumph addressed the handling limitations progressively throughout production, and by the Mark IV in 1970, they'd refined the geometry considerably. The later 1974 to 1980 models with the revised swing spring setup offered a remarkably good compromise between comfort and control. This wasn't just about luxury, it was about fatigue on long journeys. Drive an MG Midget 300 miles and you'd arrive knowing you'd been in a sports car. Drive a Spitfire the same distance, and you'd actually want to drive further. Secret 2. The front hinged bonnet. Here's something that seems simple but proved absolutely brilliant in practice. The entire front body section of the Spitfire tilted forward in one piece. The bonnet, wings, and all lifted together from a hinge point at the front, exposing the entire engine bay in one smooth motion. Any mechanic who's worked on both cars will tell you this single design feature could save hours of frustration. Need to check the oil? Simple flip. Timing adjustment? No problem. Even major work like pulling the engine became dramatically simpler because you had complete access from above and both sides simultaneously. MG owners, meanwhile, dealt with a conventional bonnet that provided limited access and required contortionist skills for many routine tasks. The Spitfire's tilt-front design came straight from the Herald Saloon, proving that clever parts sharing could benefit everyone. It also meant body repairs were often easier. Damage to one wing didn't necessarily require replacing just that panel, when the entire assembly could be assessed and worked on as a unit. This feature alone probably saved Spitfire owners hundreds of hours over their cars' lifetimes. Time is money, and in the classic car world, easy maintenance means cars actually get maintained rather than being put off until next weekend. Secret 3. The chassis frame design. While the MG Midget used a traditional monocoque construction, the Spitfire employed a separate chassis frame with the body bolted on top. Now, purists might argue monocoque is more modern, but there's engineering wisdom in Triumph's approach that shouldn't be dismissed. The separate chassis meant body rust, and British cars of this era certainly knew about rust, didn't automatically compromise structural integrity. You could restore a Spitfire body while the chassis remained solid, or vice versa. This modularity made restoration projects more approachable for home mechanics working in their garages on weekends. The chassis design also contributed to the car's surprisingly rigid feel. Despite being a small roadster, the Spitfire didn't suffer from excessive scuttle shake or cowl flex the way some competitors did. That backbone-style chassis running down the center of the car provided torsional stiffness that benefited both handling precision and driver confidence. Furthermore, this design approach meant manufacturing flexibility. Triumph could make updates to body panels without redesigning fundamental structure, allowing them to keep the Spitfire competitive looking throughout its production run without massive retooling costs. Secret 4. The Michelotti styling that actually aged well. Giovanni Michelotti's design for the Spitfire achieved something rare. It looked contemporary in 1962 and still looked handsome in 1980. The clean, crisp lines avoided the fussy details and Baroque excess that dated so many 1960s designs. Compare this to the MG Midget, which carried styling cues that clearly marked it as a product of the late 1950s. The Spitfire's relatively flat bonnet, crisp body creases, and well-proportioned stance gave it a timeless quality. Even today, a well-maintained Spitfire turns heads not because it looks oddly ancient, but because it looks genuinely attractive. The interior design followed similar principles. While not luxurious, the dashboard layout was logical, and the instruments were clearly visible. The later Mark III and Mark IV models featured improved interior appointments that genuinely enhanced the driving experience without compromising the sports car character. Michelotti understood that sports car buyers wanted style, but they also needed functionality. The large boot, for instance, could actually accommodate luggage for 2 people on a proper touring holiday, something not all small sports cars of the era managed. Secret 5. The rack and pinion steering feel. Both the Spitfire and MG Midget used rack and pinion steering, but there was something about the Spitfire's setup that provided exceptional feedback and precision. The steering ratio was quick without being nervous, requiring just 2.5 turns lock to lock in most models. Triumph's engineers mounted the rack in a way that minimized bump steer and provided consistent weight build-up through corners. This might sound technical, but what it meant in practice was simple. You could place the Spitfire exactly where you wanted it on the road with confidence. The steering communicated what the front wheels were doing, allowing experienced drivers to balance the car beautifully through flowing curves. MG's steering wasn't bad, far from it, but many drivers who've owned both cars report the Spitfire had a certain delicacy and precision that made it especially rewarding on twisty back roads. This wasn't about being faster necessarily, but about being more connected to the driving experience. The tight turning circle also made the Spitfire exceptionally maneuverable in town, which mattered for a car many owners used as daily transport. You could thread it through traffic and slot it into parking spaces larger cars could only dream about. Secret 6. The Progressive Engine Development Program. Triumph took a methodical approach to engine development that kept the Spitfire competitive throughout its production life. The original Mark I and II used a 1,047 cubic centimeter engine, producing 63 horsepower adequate but not exciting. The Mark III in 1967 brought a significant upgrade to 1,296 cubic centimeters and 75 horsepower. This wasn't just about peak power. The larger engine provided better torque across the rev range, making the car more pleasant to drive in everyday conditions. The Mark IV continued with this engine but added important refinements to emissions controls and reliability. Finally, the late model 1974 through 1980 Spitfire 1500 gained another displacement increase to 1,493 cubic centimeters, producing 71 horsepower in US specification. What's significant here is that Triumph kept the same basic engine architecture while intelligently evolving displacement and refinement. This meant parts commonality, known reliability characteristics, and a steady stream of improvements without the disruption of completely new power plants. MG, meanwhile, jumped between different engine families, which sometimes created parts supply headaches and inconsistent characteristics between model years. Secret 7. The overdrive, option, and transmission choices. Triumph offered an optional overdrive on many Spitfire models, and this seemingly small feature made enormous difference on long-distance touring. The Laycock de Normanville overdrive reduced engine speed by about 22% in top gear, transforming highway cruising from a buzzy, tiring experience into something genuinely relaxed. With overdrive engaged, a Spitfire could cruise at 60 or 70 miles per hour, with the engine turning at reasonable revolutions, improving fuel economy and reducing mechanical stress. For owners who actually used their sports cars for real journeys rather than just weekend blasts, this was invaluable. The standard 4-speed gearbox itself was well chosen, with ratios that allowed you to keep the engine in its power band without constant shifting. The shift action wasn't quite as precise as the MG's perhaps, but it was direct enough to satisfy enthusiasts and proved durable in regular use. Later models offered different final drive ratios depending on market, allowing Triumph to optimize performance for different driving conditions. This flexibility meant you could have a car properly suited to your needs, rather than accepting a one-size-fits-all compromise. Secret 8. The sensible approach to weight distribution. While the Spitfire wasn't perfectly balanced, Triumph's engineers achieved respectable weight distribution considering the constraints they faced. The relatively light engine and forward-tilting bonnet assembly helped keep weight off the front wheels, while the rear-mounted differential and fuel tank added useful weight to the back. This distribution contributed to the car's playful handling characteristics. Experienced drivers could use throttle adjustments to rotate the car through corners, making it feel nimble and responsive, even if outright grip levels weren't exceptional by modern standards. The overall curb weight of around 1,668 pounds for early models meant the modest power output was sufficient to provide entertaining performance. Later models gained weight as safety and emissions equipment was added, but even the heaviest Spitfire 1500 remained light enough to feel eager and responsive. This focus on keeping weight down also benefited fuel economy important when petrol prices soared in the 1970s. Owners reported they could achieve 30 to 35 miles per gallon with reasonable driving, making the Spitfire economical transportation as well as weekend entertainment. Secret 9. The clever parts, sharing with Herald and Vitesse. Triumph's decision to base the Spitfire on Herald mechanicals was initially about cost savings, but it created lasting benefits for owners. Many suspension components, steering parts, and mechanical elements were shared with the more common Herald and later Vitesse models, which meant better parts availability both when the cars were new and decades later as classics. This parts commonality also meant knowledge transfer. Mechanics familiar with servicing Heralds already knew much of what they needed to work on Spitfires. The learning curve was shorter, and specialized tools requirements were minimal. Furthermore, the Herald connection meant certain upgrades and improvements developed for the saloon cars eventually benefited Spitfire owners. When Triumph improved the Herald's rear suspension geometry, those lessons informed updates to the Spitfire. When engine developments proved successful in Vitesse models, they migrated to the sports car. This approach demonstrated intelligent resource management and created a support ecosystem that kept cars running longer. MG's more standalone approach sometimes meant waiting longer for parts or paying premium prices for sports car-specific components. Secret 10. The practical soft-top design. British weather being what it is, a sports car's hood needs to work properly and work often. The Spitfire's soft-top design was genuinely practical. It could be raised or lowered by one person without leaving the driver's seat in early models, and later versions improved on this with easier latching mechanisms. The top, when erected, actually provided decent weather protection. The side screens on early models were admittedly fiddly, but from the Mark III onward, wind-up windows improved refinement considerably. This meant the Spitfire could serve as year-round transportation in climates where that would be challenging with more primitive hoods. The tonneau cover option allowed owners to protect the interior when parked while maintaining the open-air silhouette. These details might seem minor, but they separated cars that got used regularly from those that stayed garaged whenever weather threatened. Storage behind the seats provided space for the folded hood without consuming all your luggage capacity, another practical consideration that made the Spitfire more livable than some competitors. Secret 11. The evolution of safety and comfort features. As regulations tightened and customer expectations evolved through the 1970s, Triumph progressively updated the Spitfire to meet new requirements while maintaining its character. The Mark IV introduced more robust bumpers, improved impact absorption, and better interior padding changes that added weight but genuinely improved crash protection. Later models featured improved seats with better lateral support, addressing one of the earlier car's few ergonomic weaknesses. The heating and ventilation systems were upgraded, making winter driving less of an endurance test. These updates weren't revolutionary individually, but collectively, they demonstrated Triumph's commitment to keeping the Spitfire relevant as market expectations evolved. Some manufacturers let their sports cars stagnate. Triumph kept refining and improving. The addition of features like intermittent wipers, improved lighting, and better instrumentation might not seem exciting, but they mattered enormously to people actually living with these cars daily. Secret 12. The surprising practicality and daily usability. Here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions of classic sports cars. The Spitfire was genuinely practical as everyday transportation. The boot could hold a week's groceries or proper luggage for two. The interior, while compact, accommodated average-sized adults comfortably for hours of driving. Fuel economy meant running costs stayed reasonable even as petrol prices climbed. Parts availability and the car's mechanical simplicity meant repairs didn't require dealer visits for every issue. An owner with basic tools and mechanical aptitude could handle much of the routine maintenance in their own garage. This practicality explains why so many Spitfires accumulated high mileage. They weren't just toys, they were transportation. Many served as first cars for young buyers who needed something economical but wanted something exciting. Others became second cars for families where fun and utility needed to coexist. The fold-down windscreen on some models allowed for truly open-air motoring experiences when conditions permitted, adding another dimension to the car's versatility that MG couldn't match. Secret 13. The strong owner, community and support network. Finally, we come to something that wasn't engineered at the factory, but emerged organically. The Triumph Spitfire developed one of the strongest, most helpful owner communities in the classic car world. Clubs formed early and persist today, providing technical support, parts sourcing assistance, and social connections. This community created extensive documentation, restoration guides, and technical resources that make owning and maintaining a Spitfire considerably easier than it might otherwise be. New owners can tap into decades of accumulated knowledge, learning from others' successes and mistakes. The parts reproduction industry has supported Spitfire owners well, with many components now available as high-quality reproductions when original parts are unavailable. This market exists because enough Spitfires survived and enough enthusiasts remained committed to keeping them running. Events, rallies, and informal gatherings give owners opportunities to share their cars with like-minded enthusiasts, turning what could be a solitary hobby into a social activity. These connections often prove invaluable when facing difficult restoration decisions or tracking down obscure components. The Triumph Spitfire's success wasn't about one brilliant innovation. It was about 13 smart decisions, clever engineering solutions, and practical approaches to sports car design that collectively created something special. While MG purists might never admit it publicly, many grudgingly respect what Triumph achieved with relatively limited resources. These weren't the fastest cars ever built, nor the most powerful or the most advanced, but they were thoughtfully engineered, attractively styled, and genuinely enjoyable to own and drive. That combination explains why, more than 40 years after the last one left the factory, Spitfires remain beloved by enthusiasts worldwide. For those of you who owned Spitfires back in the day, or perhaps still maintain one today, share your experiences in the comments below. Which of these engineering solutions did you appreciate most? What other clever details have we missed? The collective knowledge of this audience is extraordinary, and your stories help preserve the history of these remarkable little cars. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Spitfire engineering, please consider subscribing to the channel and clicking that like button. It helps us continue creating content that treats these classic cars with the respect and accuracy they deserve. Thank you for watching, and remember, the joy of classic car ownership often lies not in the specifications, but in the clever thinking that went into creating machines that still bring smiles decades later. The Spitfire engineers understood that, and we're all richer for their efforts.